think about meetings that you attend at DU, do any of these comments apply? Sometimes we meet just to meet, even if we really have nothing to talk about. Our meetings are more of a free-for-all that lacks structure, not to mention facilitation. We invite people to our meetings who don't really need to be there or have nothing to add. We have some meetings where people ramble on and on and on and nothing is done to reel them in. Our meetings tend to be more of a one-sided monologue from our leader with little to no participation. Over half our meetings could be handled offline without taking up everyone's time. If any of those statements resonated with you, then congratulations, you came to the right place. Welcome to Fridays at Noon. My name is Greg Giesen. I am the manager of people development, and joining me is Heidi Perman.
You got it.
I'm sorry about that. Yeah, Heidi Perman, Executive Director of Career and Professional Development. Welcome, Heidi.
Thank you.
Today we're going to talk about the keys to effectively facilitating a meeting. And I want to mention that we're going to use more of a very informal, just dialogue approach to this, because we both have taught this a lot, and so we're just going to kind of answer some general questions and go from there. So why don't we start with some of the easier questions? I don't know if these are easier, but obvious questions is, when is it a good idea to have a meeting?
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really great question, because I think we just get in this default mode that you always have to have a meeting when it's on the calendar. And I think to stop and really reflect what's the right time for a meeting, maybe when is it less ideal, is really important. One of the things that I hear a lot of feedback about is people have meetings on their calendars, and so they just go and the leader just has them because they're there and they feel obligated to meet weekly or monthly. And so I think really it's important to make sure there's a purpose for the meeting and that the leader really feels clear about that. Otherwise, to consider canceling it, I think, is really important. Meetings can be best utilized when there's a lot of complex decisions that need to be made, where a lot of input is necessary. They can be great for brainstorming when there's a lot of ideas that we need to get out on the table, perhaps when there's a lot of strategic planning going on and new initiatives and innovation. That can be a really good time to get people at the table to brainstorm and think outside of the box. Complex updates can be really important to have in a group situation so that people can ask questions, that you can take the time to explain things that are more complex. Oftentimes people give feedback that they don't love meetings when they are really brief, easy updates. If that's all the meeting is.
Well, we're gonna get to that one.
Right.
So, all right. So, probably the key thing, because you emphasized complex a few times, something where you need to be able to have a dialogue back and forth to explain, to expound. Those kind of things are really critical, right?
Absolutely. It's thinking through how are you using those meetings as an opportunity to make sure people's voices are heard.
Yeah.
And I think bringing people together, ultimately that's the idea, is that people are having an opportunity to share their thoughts and ideas and participate.
Yeah.
Because when you think about employee engagement, people want to be heard. They want to feel like their opinion counts. And so meetings are most effectively used to provide that opportunity.
And another advantage of meetings, it could be an advantage, is really to provide team cohesion and collaboration, because it might be the only time that people are really getting together.
Right.
But the one thing I would emphasize is, don't assume that just happens by having people in a room.
Right.
There has to be an intent to make that happen during the meeting.
Absolutely.
Right.
And relationship building is a huge part of teams working well together. Yeah. And especially when a team is very early in their relationship together, that might actually be critically important to give people that opportunity to build rapport, connect with one another, so that they work effectively together and feel comfortable sharing really honest thoughts and communication with each other in future meetings as well.
All right. So going back to what you were earlier getting into, when should a group not meet?
Right. Well, when it's really basic, to the thing I was referring to before, when it's really basic information that's being shared that could just as effectively be communicated via email, that might not necessarily be the great time for a meeting. So that's a huge one that I think I hear the most complaints. Not having a meeting if there's no clear agenda, or if that's not even the right group of people to be making those decisions. So I think that's really critical as well. Making sure that enough of the prep work is done so that you're ready to meet. So sometimes people will meet, but there's pre-work that could have been done to make that meeting more successful. So do we need to compile data and research and information to inform that meeting? And if so, let's hold off until that pre-work has been done to make sure that it's as effective as possible.
Yeah, because you want people prepared if they're going to be there. Another one that I came up with, when being in the same room adds nothing to the process. Right. So there's no advantage to that.
Yeah. And sometimes a large group of people coming together for a simple task actually slows it down.
Yeah.
So what's the right number of people to have in the room? When is it actually better accomplished by a small subgroup of your team rather than having the entire team at the table?
Well, and that kind of leads us into the next question, actually, is what are some alternatives to meeting?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think number one, when is email communication an option? Sometimes if it's just sharing of information, email, and it's simple information that we don't think is going to cause a lot of emotional reaction or questions from people, sometimes simple email communications can be helpful. Looking at if it's document creation, sometimes having shared documents and using things like the tools that we have in Office 365 to work on a document simultaneously from our individual offices might actually be more effective than trying to talk through a document in a room. So I think those are a couple of things that oftentimes people don't use as often as they could. But also, sometimes quick meetings might actually be easier, especially if people are spread across campus. Do online. Use tools like Zoom to bring together people on their computers having a quick conversation. Tools like that, if you're not familiar with it, allow you to document share, screen share, and also video chat with colleagues. And I've used that a number of times, especially when people are remote, in order to have conversations really quickly from our individual office spaces. And that saves travel time a lot, too, when people are running across campus for meetings.
And here are some other things to think about on that. Now, this is actually a meeting per se, but it's called the huddle. Have you heard of that?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like a 5-minute.
Yeah.
Everybody gets together, it's a standing meeting, and it's like, all right, what do you have going on today? Everybody shares that. Is there anything you need from the group? And is there anything we need to know? And it's like it's a huddle. It's like, all right, go. Like a football huddle. And just by doing that, sometimes you can cover a lot of the basics, which then eliminates repeating a lot of that at a meeting.
Right.
There's also, can you accomplish what you need to accomplish with a quick face-to-face with people?
Right.
And so you're still getting that contact, you're still verbally doing it, but you're not taking up everybody's time. Like you said, smaller groups, maybe how about the four of you, have a meeting, discuss it, and bring it back to the larger group instead of us trying to do that in one big session. You talked about online discussion groups, right?
Yeah.
So, and it could be an assignment. By Thursday, everybody go in, read that, make a comment, and then we can talk about it. And then you've cut off half the time needed.
Absolutely.
Those kind of things. The Leadership Academy here at DU, as a whole group, they only meet once every 3 weeks. So they heavily rely on Google Docs and things like that to have their communications. And then they have little subgroups. But when they get together as a whole group, they're like a mean machine. They're very efficient.
Right, because the pre-work has been done and all that background work is accomplished.
Things like that. So if, like you said, if a leader's got a lot to say, but it's really one-sided communication, they should seriously think about other avenues in bringing people together, unless they want all the things we talked about with the dialogue and the conversation and things like that.
Well, I think it's knowing, too, there's so many options like you just described, and it's knowing what works for your team and the needs and the information that has to be communicated with your team. Because the huddle works really well for some groups, and it might not feel necessary or useful if a team doesn't have a ton of intersection in their work on a day-to-day basis. So, and I know of several teams around campus that do use huddles and love it for quick touch bases, so they don't have to have full-hour regular meetings, and it saves them a lot of time to do it that way.
All right, so let's talk about why meetings fail. And I got a series of them, but I'll let you go first.
I think one of the biggest things that I observe is a lack of preparation. So I think as the leader and facilitator, being really planful in advance, and that is things like having an agenda, knowing what are we going to cover in that meeting and being really clear about that. I also think taking the time to really plot out, we've got an hour, how much of each how much time is each of these agenda items realistically going to take? Because meetings fail a lot because we're trying to cram way too much information, and that's just not realistic to allow that space for authentic discussion. So as a leader, I think it's important to set that agenda, really think through what needs to be covered, and to do that 48 hours in advance, I think ideally, 24 hours in advance. I recommend that if someone's regularly facilitating meetings, that they book a half hour in their calendar a few days in advance of that meeting, just as also a standing meeting, so that they are giving themselves the time to accurately prepare that agenda and any collateral material that that team is going to need to be successful in that conversation. I think that's huge, and underestimated how big of a positive impact that can have.
Yeah. All right, you ready for my list? This comes from an article in Fast Company.
Okay.
Based on research that they did. And so to complement what you already said, they said, number one, and I don't know if these are in order, but meetings are boring. And what they mean by that, according to researcher Shirley Lee, 9 out of 10 people daydream in meetings, and 60% of meeting attendees take notes to appear as if they're listening.
I believe that completely.
Yeah, everybody in the room can relate to that.
When you ask them to see their notes, it's all doodles, right?
and Patrick Lencioni, author of Death by Meetings, a lot of people use his book, says that meetings are tedious, unengaging, and dry, which I can vouch for. Number two, people don't take meetings seriously, and this ties into your part about they're not prepared. They arrive late, they leave early, and they spend much of their time on their cell phones, whether overtly or covertly, checking emails. They're not present, basically. Which says that what they're doing is more important than what's happening in the room, which gets to some of our other future points. Meetings are too long. Research says that meetings should never exceed 90 minutes. Now, some of them do, but if they do, I hope that they're broken up in some way, shape, or form.
Like a retreat. I mean, you definitely have to have breaks in there.
Let's see. According to meeting experts, most meetings should accomplish twice as much in half the time. And then here's the other thing. I want to get your opinion on this. Whether you like it or not, Monday mornings are a transition period and not a good time to have meetings. What's your take on that?
I think you have to ask your team. So let me give you an example of that. I had a team that was constantly meeting late in the week, and they all expressed frustration about that because they would walk away with a lot of action items and not have time to accomplish them before the week was out. And they actually asked to have the meetings on Mondays or Tuesdays because they walked away with action items, but they still had time to feel like they made progress on those things and didn't go home as stressed on the weekend with all of this list of things to do. But I think you have to ask your team and know what works for them.
Yeah, because you can be stressful going in Monday and not being prepared, right? And you haven't transitioned. Some of the other items that the article cited is people wander off topic, right? Yes. And we know that according to a national survey by Office Team, runaway meetings are the biggest time wasters in the workplace. And that could either be somebody rambling or somebody switching topics as they're talking. Most people don't use or ever know what a parking lot is. Right. Why don't you explain what a parking lot is?
So oftentimes in meetings when people do ramble or go off topic or segue into something else, the parking lot basically is you capture that idea so it doesn't get lost. That's a really great idea. We don't want to lose that. And oftentimes it's as simple as writing it on a Post-it note and putting it on a whiteboard or on a sheet of paper that's listed as the parking lot. And the point is we're going to capture that idea and make sure it gets addressed in a future meeting, but it's out of scope for today. So it's just a great strategy of honoring that person's ideas and thoughts and saving it for a more appropriate discussion in time.
Another one is nothing happens once the meeting ends, and you kind of talk to this. Decisions are not converted to actions, or there's no follow-up, no accountability, or no consequences for people not doing what they said they were going to do. Another one is candor and honesty are limited, meaning that either there's not an opportunity to talk, or if there is, it's not an open environment, or it's not safe to say what you really think.
That's
huge. And as a result, what happens is groupthink can kind of take over the group, whereas people will yield to the person that's doing the talking, or they'll yield to 2 or 3 people that have been there longest because they don't think their opinion matters, so they won't even challenge it. And then the group kind of makes an agreement on something that they're really not in agreement about. meetings are missing key people. You talk to that. And what happens is they have the meeting anyways, but they can't make any decisions. And so it's just a real time killer. We talked about meeting leaders often lack the facilitation skills, which is part of what this session's about.
Right.
And the last one is meetings never get better. And they don't get better because the meeting facilitator doesn't ask for feedback on how the meeting's going.
Right.
And as a result, they don't get the feedback, so they just keep the pattern going of the way we're doing it is the way we do it.
Right. Or even not even giving feedback on the back end, but on the front end. Do you ever ask your team before you create a team meetings about how long do you want it to be? What do you want the agenda to be? Because if they have ownership in creating that weekly or monthly meeting, they're much more likely to be there. I was part of a team where I came on as a leader, and the team was very clear they hated their staff meetings. And so that was the first thing I did. What do you all want them to look like, since this has clearly been a pain point for you? And to my surprise, they wanted 2-hour meetings, which I probably would not have ever, done on my own. And they had a really clear sense of why they wanted that to be 2 hours. They wanted to cover some of the visioning and the decision making together as a team. But in this case, it was a group of career counselors, and many of them were young professionals. And they wanted to use a set time at the end for case studies and to talk about the challenging clients. And so while that would have not been what I had, thought of a 2-hour meeting, they had a clear need and purpose that was communicated because we opened it up for them to create the meeting that they wanted to come to.
Yeah. In HR, we did a meeting evaluation essentially, and we kind of recreated the meeting, which looked nothing like we had been having for 2 years.
Right.
But the question was never asked for 2 years.
Yeah, you don't have to keep doing it because it's the way it's always been done, and I think that freedom to change and ask that question is really important.
Yeah, maybe the most important place to start, right? What's working, what's not.
Yeah, listen.
All right, so what are the essential components of a meeting?
And I think some people would answer this differently depending upon their leadership style. We've talked about agenda. For the most part, starting on time and ending on time, I think, is really important. I'm a little more probably firm about ending on time than I am about starting on time, because we're in this campus climate where people are running from meeting to meeting, and I get that. So, but I try to really end on time to respect other people's meetings and the things that they have going on. Making sure that you're really involving as many people in that room as possible, because again, it makes them want to come back when they feel that there is a purpose for them being there. So making sure to listen, making sure to ask people for their feedback so that they feel that they have added value to the meeting. That's really big. Some people will make sure that they're on the same page about the expectations around meetings as well. So in terms of getting people to contribute and getting people to not over contribute, potentially setting ground rules as a group and team early on, I think can be important. A lot, but those are a few that initially come to mind.
Well, let me follow up and ask you some questions too on this. Desired outcomes. Is that important to state as part of the agenda?
Yeah, I think to have not only the agenda items, but what are the questions you want to discuss? Because for people who in particular are introverted, they might actually need time to think through those questions in advance. So when that agenda is being crafted, if you want people's opinions on things, put those questions that are going to be discussed right up front in advance, and again, any supporting documentation, because that way people can come prepared and know exactly what decisions are going to be made, and they can come ready to make those decisions much more efficiently. So, and the introverts will thank you for it, because they do need time to think and process before coming into that conversation. Yeah,
definitely a key point. I want to emphasize to our viewers what's called the 2/3 rule. And that is, I'm going to read it. Each member should have a vested interest, input, or be impacted by at least 2/3 of the agenda. And that should help facilitators determine who needs to be at this meeting. Because all too often you've got people who aren't interested in 2/3 of the topic, and they're there, and that's why they're on their cell phones and trying to entertain themselves, because it's not relevant.
Right.
And no thought had been put into that.
And I think when you see people pulling cell phones out and distracted, I always say take that as a personal challenge to think about how could I have crafted this meeting differently to keep them so engaged that they actually can't do that or don't have time to do that.
And it also reveals that there's no ground rule around cell phones.
Right, back to ground rules, absolutely.
Back to ground rules, like, what would be realistic for a group? How many should they have?
I don't necessarily worry about a number, but I encourage them to co-create that because it's not me as a leader setting, here's what the ground rules are. It's what do you all expect of each other in a meeting, because if people have participated in creating those ground rules, they will stick to it. And I think that's really important.
Yeah.
So to let that group decide, some common ones, phone, timeliness, those are big. The step up, step back if you're really talkative. Make a commitment to make sure you're leaving space for your more quiet colleagues. If you're more quiet, step up. Yeah. So step up, step back is a common one. Staying positive is one that I push out a lot in teams. Yeah. It's okay to disagree with someone, and that's actually healthy and important that we get differences of opinion at the table. Just do it in a positive and respectful way. Yeah. Share other ideas, because those are going to make our project stronger and our work together stronger if we make sure all of those different voices are heard. Just do it in a way that's tactful and kind.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen groups overdo it with 15, 16, and then they become meaningless.
Because there's too many.
There's too many.
Do you have a thought of what your mindset is?
I mean, I think kind of what you said is you start with the ones that you know are relevant to the group, and that might just be 3 or 4. And then if you have to build on it, you do. But the other thing, advantage of ground rules is it empowers the group. And what I mean by that is if we have a ground rule about rambling, let's say, stay on topic, it allows the group to co-facilitate.
Right.
Or a peer could say, okay, Charlie, where it's not everybody's looking to the one facilitator to be the person to police the group. And ultimately, you would want a group to co-facilitate if you could. That would be like an ideal scenario. The advantage of the agenda, too, there's multiple advantages, right? It gives you pre-work, people are prepared. It also gives permission to the facilitator to say, all right, let's move on because we've got 2 more items and we're down to 7 minutes. Right. And it just makes it easier to kind of maneuver through the meeting by having that. Summarize decisions at the end. Here's what we've decided, here's who's accountable, those kind of things.
I think the who's accountable is really important because sometimes facilitators walk away feeling like now I'm responsible for everything. So what are the next steps and action items, and who's going to step up and take them?
Who's going to step up and
do it? And if there's silence in the room, it's a good opportunity to say, do we have the capacity for this? Do you all have buy-in on this? And facilitators really need to do that. Otherwise, they end up walking away with all the work, which is not key.
And we talked about, meeting evaluations. And here's a suggestion I would have. It's just periodically, not every meeting, but do it verbally. Mm-hmm. Not anything formal, but let's say I'm the facilitator of the meeting. I could say, all right, and it's an agenda item, only 5 minutes at the end. What worked? What worked today? What didn't work? And then what could I as a facilitator do more of or less of? And again, it's just verbal, jot it down, and then you're continually refining the meeting to fit the needs of the group, which is really what makes it a good thing. What about the follow-up minutes? Like, how important is that? Who does it? How in-depth should it be?
That's another one where I think you need to know your team and when those minutes are helpful. So I think there's some cases where really critical information is covered at meetings. Not everyone's there. So having a document that people can reference where they know they can find out those things is really important. People take vacation, have sick days, and that's a way to make sure that they're informed. In other cases, if people know that those are not getting read, I think sometimes a shorter version where it's action items can sometimes be an in-between no meeting minutes and really long meeting minutes that no one reads. So one approach is at the end of the meeting, here were the agreed upon items and here are the action items and who's responsible for them. And that will go reinforce the summary at the end, that we're all on the same page about the decisions that were made so someone can object if that's not what they understood. It gets everybody on the same page. And then that delegation piece and the action items. So short version can sometimes be a nice option because that's the critical stuff that sometimes gets lost in really long meeting minutes. Is in the process of reading through them, they miss that they were supposed to do something, or by when, or there was confusion over agreed upon items. So
Yeah.
that documentation can sometimes be helpful for
Yeah.
people to reference.
Shorter is sweeter, the better, right? Because nobody
I
wants to
prefer it
read
that
a
way.
narrative at all. All right, so some of this might be repetitive, but I want to talk about the role of the facilitator per se. What are some of the key roles?
The agenda, making sure there's preparation and a plan. The other thing I think a facilitator, the hardest parts about being a facilitator is managing some of the difficult behaviors, but what that requires is some assertiveness, right? To jump in when things are getting off track, to point out that we have other agenda items to get to during our time frame. So when I think about the role of the facilitator, oftentimes it's to move things along and be somewhat assertive, and that might mean sometimes jumping in a little bit. That sometimes might be getting people back on track, and that does require sometimes you to do things that feel uncomfortable, a little bit of interrupting or jumping in, and that takes practice to be comfortable doing that. I don't necessarily know that everybody, earlier in their career feels comfortable doing that, but my tip is observe other leaders. Observe people who are good meeting facilitators and see how they do that subtly. I remember being at the Diversity Summit in the last couple of years, and the speaker opened it to questions, and someone was talking pretty long as they were asking their question, and he did just such a graceful job of jumping in saying, "That's such a wonderful statement. Let me comment." And it was just a lovely, gracious way. But be an observer. Pay attention when people do that, how they've done it in a way that was very gracious and not didn't seem like interrupting or off-putting to that person.
Well, and that's the skill piece, right? It's entering a conversation or interrupting somebody in a respectful way to acknowledge where they're at and then move it wherever it needs to move.
You got it.
Then it just feels smooth. But if it's an awkward interjection of, "Charlie, you ever going to make a point?" Obviously that's going to unsettle everything, and unless you know Charlie really well and you can tease him about that.
Well, and that's where that foundational relationship amongst the team that you cultivate makes that a little more comfortable as well.
Of course, if there's any new people in the meeting, that would be the facilitator to make sure they get introduced. You talked about earlier, state the purpose and any desired outcomes, just to make sure we're all clear on the same page of what we're doing. You may have to reiterate a couple ground rules. At last meeting we got a little loose with the A or B, so let's just make sure we're mindful of those things. You're kind of setting the stage, right, for everything, and then you're just making sure it's smoothly moving on. If a decision has to be made, you'll have to kick into how are we going to make this decision. Well, let's talk about that right now. What are the keys in that moment that people need to know if a decision needs to be made?
Yeah, I think make it very apparent that our goal today is to make a certain decision. Make sure that you're asking questions, the pros and cons or the possible things that we could do. And then really be an observer as a facilitator. Have we heard from everyone? And make sure to pull in the voices that haven't necessarily spoken up. Some people will really need that invite in order to chime in their opinions. So that's phase one, is really how are you cultivating and listening. Phase two is kind of looking for, are you seeing a very obvious theme emerge? So it really seems we have consensus, or it seems we have a really clear divide. So then to start to ask additional questions that might uncover common ground, that helps with that decision. And I oftentimes encourage people to think about the 80-20 rule. Many times in meetings, and I think I observe this a lot in higher ed especially, we want 100% consensus all the time. We don't want to leave anyone behind in that decision, and that's really hard to get to. It's really hard to have 100% agreement all the time, and when we wait for that to get there, we can sometimes really delay processes, projects, and meetings. So some teams have a ground rule of an 80-20 rule where as long as we're in 80% agreement, we're going to move forward with a decision, because we recognize that not everybody is always going to come to that 100% consensus. My caution with that 80-20 rule is to be very observant of where that 20% lies, because we don't want to marginalize voices of diverse participants in our meetings and in our project groups.
Yeah, because if they're not in agreement, so what does that mean? What does their support look like? So that they're not at the water cooler, having a second meeting after the meeting talking about the decision they didn't like, those kind of things.
Yeah, and if you have 20% that are concerned or think that there's another direction, how do we address as many of those concerns and needs then moving forward so that those concerns are still very much addressed, even if the decision is moving in a slightly different way?
So some of these things are things we've already talked about, but I just want to reiterate. So direct discussions or keep people on topic. Right, and again, that's where the agenda comes in. But if they're getting off, in fact, I did this just yesterday. I was at a meeting. A very gregarious person who loves to talk got up, and the whole question was, what did you get out of this program last year? And as she started talking, she went into the political climate and how we really need to. And so I just gently said, so back to the question of what did you get out? And that's what I said. And everybody laughed, and she's. And she answered the question and then sat down. So it worked perfectly, but you've got to really be paying attention to stay on top of those kind of things.
Absolutely.
And if you can have fun doing it, that's like a bonus, right?
Right. And going to having fun doing it, there's many organizations that one of their ground rules is they have a code word for when things are getting off a topic that anyone can share. So some organizations might have the code word jellyfish to symbolize we're floating off topic, and anyone on the team can say jellyfish, or I think we're having a jellyfish moment. There's a company here in town called Medtronic, a medical device, and their word is squirrel. Squirrel. That idea that the dog is distracted and they see a squirrel. It's from a cartoon animated movie, but that's their code word, and everybody knows that when something's going off topic, it's a shared word that they can use that's playful, right, to get people back on track.
Yeah. All right. So what are other roles in the meeting that other people can do?
Certainly back to the note-taking, some people have someone who's assigned to jot down those key decisions so that the leader is not trying to track that and some of those details. Some people will have someone who's tracking time for the group. I think you have to just know your group and if those are helpful and needed pieces or maybe less critical. So those are the common ones. Some people share facilitation across their team, and others will have the leader do that. Again, know your team, know if they have strong facilitation skills, that they want to be doing that. Some might be very uncomfortable with that. If the agenda is really your agenda, it can be uncomfortable for someone else to try to facilitate that conversation. So I think it's knowing your team and the meeting style, and if those things would work well.
Yeah, because not everybody on the team is a facilitator, wants to be facilitator, or has the skills to be a facilitator.
Exactly.
Right. All right, so let's get into some troubleshooting scenarios. Oh, the one thing I wanted to mention too is a facilitator, and this is maybe my pet peeve, but I don't like to be the scribe on the flip chart while I'm facilitating. Because there's downtime in writing, which is no facilitation time, and it adds up, and it creates this like continuous break while you're writing. And so it's better to have somebody, would you agree, someone else doing the writing on the flip chart while you're facilitating?
Yeah, and I think, again, going with what's comfortable, I also don't like to take notes when I'm facilitating, but each person has to know if that is easier or faster for them to capture the ideas.
Yeah, okay. All right, so these are troubleshooting scenarios that we've heard from many people, and so we're just going to toss them out and talk about them. Some of them we've already indirectly addressed, right? We already talked about how important it is to have the agenda, right? That's
very important.
Very, very, very important. What if it's just a group of three, a very small team?
If it's a really small group and it's more of a shared conversation, I don't bring agendas or use agendas. I do have some members of my team that helps them prepare, right? Yeah. So I have members of my team that in our weekly or biweekly meetings, they will bring an agenda to help them stay organized, but I think that's a little more fluid in those smaller groups and knowing what works with those dynamics.
The other thing about an agenda on paper is it's a place where people can put notes, in a centralized place, might make it easier for them.
Right.
All right, so what do you do with the rambler?
Yep.
Person who just likes to hear themselves talk.
Right. We've talked about being an assertive facilitator and sometimes jumping in a really gracious way. That's helpful. If you know you're going to a meeting with people that are prone to that, I think, or on the flip side, even prone to being quiet, you can sometimes bring techniques to a meeting that help with that. So one example of that would be something called go rounds, where you have a question that's thrown out to the group, and everybody writes one idea per Post-it note. And you give them some time to do that, and that's helpful for people who need a moment to get their thoughts together. One idea for each Post-it note, and then you have people go around and read what's on their Post-it note, one person at a time. And I've seen this be very effective in a number of situations because, number one, we've all of a sudden created a very equal playing field where everyone can read every one of their ideas and none of them is lost. That also is really helpful because the group can hear all of the themes and where the agreement areas are immediately. I love to take those Post-it notes back to my office and then group them, and it really can sometimes make decisions and lists come together really quickly. The other time that's very helpful, not only the rambler or the person that's quiet, that's very helpful when there's a hierarchical difference in the room. So I used that once when we were facilitating a conversation in groups of 6, and it was a faculty member, a grad student, an undergrad student, an employer, and a staff member, and then a campus liaison. Well, we wanted to make sure the undergrad voice was heard with an employer and a faculty person sitting there, and we knew that dynamic might be very intimidating. So there's that technique basically created this very even playing field so that everyone's voice was being heard. But people can't ramble in that situation. They're really forced to make sure everybody's voice is heard. So that's one technique that I find to be really useful for a variety of reasons.
And we talked about if you have a group that has propensity to do that, that could be a good ground rule. So everybody's kind of managing each other.
Yep.
And if you had to intervene, as we've talked about, like probably the way I would do it, related to, again, previous conversations is, Paul, that I know that's going to be a great story or you're starting to get into, but for the sake of time, can we just stick to really what do you think we should do? Because a lot of people, they got so many stories and they've got to use them as examples, but those are the things sometimes you really have to nip in the bud, even if they might enhance the comment.
Yeah.
There's a time and a place.
And I think if you know that there's individuals in your team that are more prone to that, I think that's where you have to tap into those crucial conversations and have side conversations with people and say, you have really valuable ideas, but what I'm observing is the way that you're talking through them and the detail you're providing is actually making it difficult for other people to share their stories. I had a team where I had a very extroverted graduate student on the team and a very introverted first-year student. And so that dynamic was very obviously playing out, where one person had a very big voice at the table and the other one. So I had a conversation with that person. You have phenomenal ideas. I want you to hold back a little bit and make sure to encourage the voice of those other individuals. And super receptive to that conversation. It just hadn't occurred to that individual before that dynamic might actually be challenging for that first-year student.
Yeah. Because some of us, I think we're in these meetings where maybe it's not our meeting, and so nobody says anything. There's no evaluation. So in a sense, we become enablers of the dysfunction that occurs in the meeting, right? Does room setup matter?
I think it can.
Yeah.
I mean, I think if you want a dialogue to happen, to have a round table where people can see each other and really hear each other, I think is extremely valuable to those dialogue situations. If someone's at the front of the room with everybody lined up, it's not really... it really is putting you in that position as information sharer and expert, as opposed to creating that more equal environment where people are more comfortable sharing.
Yeah. So the more there's going to be dialogue, the better it is for people to be able to see each other.
I think so.
Yeah. Okay. Kind of a related question what we've been talking about. How do you get people to participate in a meeting?
Yeah. I think some of the techniques, like literally that Post-it note activity, is a way to get 100% engagement. I've also had times where I've given people papers to fill out and answer some questions, and then I open it up to dialogue. So the benefit of that is if it's a high-stakes conversation and I want to make sure everyone's voice is heard, but I know that some might not feel comfortable sharing their thoughts because it's a high-stakes conversation and they think there's going to be disagreement with their statement, I can still collect some of that information and make sure everyone's voice is heard, or highly encourage people to email me additional thoughts afterward as well. But again, that is another way to make sure you're getting 100% participation. In training, there's a common exercise of think, pair, share. You have people take a moment to write down their ideas, share with a neighbor or another person, and then open it up as a group. And what I find is that, again, you're getting 100% engagement. someone sometimes is reinforcing their idea or having a similar idea, and it builds people's confidence to sharing in that group. So that's a really great strategy that oftentimes is used in teaching and training, but is also extremely valuable in meetings.
Yeah. And you can always assign homework that at the next meeting, we want to have a discussion on this and I want to hear from everybody, and you kind of give them a heads up that way.
Yeah.
People can kind of prepare. What about, I've seen facilitators call people out. Like, John, you haven't said anything. What do you think about, what's your thought about that technique?
I think you have to know the group and team and if they're comfortable with that. I think there are some people who really dislike that and get very frustrated. One way I've worked around that is if I know someone has an expertise and I want them to share it in the meeting, sometimes I'll prep them beforehand. You had a really good idea about this. Would you share it in the meeting, and get their permission, and then pull that in if I know that person might be taken off guard if I call them in. So sometimes to get that expectation in advance, can I get your feedback and have you share this with the group so that they're prepared for it, can sometimes be the middle ground. If you know people don't like that, it gives them a heads up and you're getting their permission. The team that I work with now, I think, is pretty comfortable and is very willing to share. So I do draw people in and ask, what do you think about this? You have a lot of experience on the topic. So, but that doesn't work for everybody. You really have to follow your gut and know what's working and not working for your team. Yeah,
it seems like everything we've talked about comes back to knowing your team and what they need and what works for them as a collective group.
Absolutely.
Knowing that it may not work for every individual. And that's where that meeting evaluation piece, or at least that feedback piece, is so critical. And it's probably the one thing that I realize does not happen the most, for whatever reason.
And I think it's important to notice, too, that there's cultural differences and diversity differences. So in some cultures, speaking up and criticizing or giving contrary feedback to someone in a public forum is just really uncomfortable, and so that's where giving multiple mechanisms for feedback and not just having it be in a public forum, I think, is really important. Yeah.
Should the leader of the group be the facilitator? What's your, I've heard different schools of thought on that. What's your take?
I think it depends on if that agenda is really co-created by the team and is a shared agenda and everyone's pulling that together, and people are comfortable facilitating, shared facilitation can work just fine. There are some situations where a leader has a very aggressive agenda, they have things that they need to get out of that, and to hand that over to someone else on the team might actually be really uncomfortable. So I think it depends on the topic. I think it depends on the facilitation skills of that group, and a little bit just what that dynamic is with that meeting. Is it really a shared agenda and meeting and decision-making process?
Yeah, and the other angle of that is if the leader really wants to roll up their sleeves and kind of get into the conversation, it's hard to do that and facilitate at the same time, right? So you may have to pass it off just for that part of the meeting, have somebody else facilitate, and then take it over again, whatever. Okay, so let's see. We've covered almost everything. Some facilitators complain that they are doing all the work, and you talked about this earlier, be it overseeing assignments, following up, and what do they do? Because the whole burden is falling on them.
Yeah. Well, I do think how you wrap up a meeting is important, and I do think there's a certain amount of work when you are the facilitator in terms of that agenda and preparation. I do think facilitators oftentimes walk away with feeling like they have the homework or the action items for the meeting, and so the wrap-up is important. Confirming what we've agreed upon, discussing what are the next action items that have to happen, and making sure you leave space for that when you're creating your agenda. So to lay out those action items and ask who's responsible, get those names down so that it is a shared responsibility, I think is important. I think your ground rules at the beginning can also include, here are the ground rules, and we're going to hold each other accountable for those. I'm not the one who's holding us accountable for those. So even your ground rules can say, we're going to hold each other accountable to these as one of those things that's discussed right up front. Because then that takes the jumping in, getting people on topic, and puts that on everybody, and not just the facilitator.
Yeah, and one of the key things to look for is if you see after the meeting that the second meetings are occurring where people are talking about the meeting in little pods, then that's a good time to do an evaluation at the next one because something's not working.
Right. And I think too, when you have meetings that have a lot going on, again, break into subgroups to tackle some of those topics and then come back together, because a large group making all of these different decisions can slow things down. And again, that takes it off of the facilitator to facilitate every one of the action items that needs. Go put work teams together. You two go work on this, you go work on that, and let's come back together. Yeah. Then there's more automatic ownership because people are coming with updates and what they've worked on and got feedback. So then that also starts to get others involved in a somewhat facilitator role also.
Yeah. All right, so kind of wrap it up. What would be a first step for people that maybe haven't really thought about any of this, but they're in meetings?
Yeah. We cover a lot in this conversation and when we do trainings on this. And I always say, pick 2 things that really resonate with you from all of these ideas. All the things that we've discussed are not going to work for everybody and every team and their style. So don't try to make your meetings something that they're not. If a huddle doesn't work, don't do it. That it's an option. But picking and choosing from these suggestions today 2 things that you think would really help, and just try them and get used to them and implement them and practice a little bit, and then come back and see, all right, those were helpful, they weren't. Now what else could you add and try to see what works with your team? Becoming an effective meeting facilitator takes practice, assertiveness, a little trial and error of figuring out what works for your team. And I also say being a really big observer of your team. Do they seem engaged? Do they seem that they're really quiet? Observe what the behaviors are. Is someone rolling their eyes? And sometimes being a really big observer helps you know which of these techniques you need to be using.
Yeah. I've seen groups that they selected a person to be the meeting evaluator, just one person, and then at the end of the meeting they just gave some general feedback. What I thought worked, what I thought, just keeping it going.
Yeah.
I mean, because I would say, to kind of complement what you said, is one thing departments could do is, if you have more than one facilitator, in the group, watch this video and then have a conversation right after it about, okay, what are we doing that's working, what's not, what should we try?
Yeah.
And then kind of going back to sum it all up, which we've talked about a few times, is start with some kind of assessment. What's working, what's not, what do we need to change? And then that will give you your 1 or 2 things maybe to start applying, and then you just kind of go from there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Great.
Well, thank you, Heidi, for taking the time.
Of course. Happy to do so. Thanks for inviting me.
Yes, and we'll see you at our next Friday's.